The sound that ended Harriet Marsh's childhood was not a door slamming. It was quieter than that and somehow worse. It was the soft final click of a latch, settling into place, the kind of sound a house makes when it has decided you no longer belong inside it. She stood on the porch in the thin September air, 18 years old, with a small leather satchel over one shoulder and a weight in her chest that she refused to name. The morning was pale and cold, the kind of cold that arrives not as a dramatic announcement, but as a slow, creeping fact, the way winter always comes to the high country of Wyoming, without apology and without warning. In her left hand, she held a plain envelope. Inside it were $17, which represented the sum total of what her father believed she was owed by the world. In her right hand, she held a folded piece of paper, brittle at the edges, printed with faded official ink. A deed. A land claim to a parcel of ground nobody in Rimrock had ever found a use for, situated at the base of a granite cliff face 12 miles east of town, in a place the locals called Hollow Rock. Her father, Wendell Marsh, had placed both items on the breakfast table that morning, without ceremony, without explanation, and without meeting her eyes. He was a tall man with a weathered face and hands that had been shaped by 30 years of work into something that looked more like tools than flesh. He was not a cruel man. Harriet had understood that from a young age, in the way that children understand the essential nature of their parents long before they have the words for it. He was simply a man who lived by arithmetic. The farm had lost money 2 seasons running. There was Fletcher to think about, her younger brother, 14 years old and still needing. One less mouth was a number that improved the ledger. She had not argued. There was nothing to argue against because there had been no argument made. Wendell had set the envelope and the deed on the table, poured his coffee, and sat down. That was the whole of it. What she remembered afterwards, standing on the porch with the latch click behind her, was not her father's face. It was the moment just before she walked out, when Wendell had pushed his chair back from the table as if he meant to say something, and she had waited, and he had gone to the stove to refill his cup instead. That moment, that small and devastating choice, told her everything she needed to know about what came next. There would be no words. There never had been. Wendell Marsh was a man who communicated in silences, and his silences had weight. She did not look back at the house. She had permitted herself one glance at the window of the room she had shared with no one, the small bedroom on the east side where the morning light came in flat and gold. And in that glance, she had seen Fletcher standing behind the rippled glass, his face pressed slightly forward, his breath fogging the pain. He was not crying. He was watching the way a person watches something they want to memorize before it disappears. She turned away from him and walked toward the road. The question that settled into her mind somewhere around the first mile was not the obvious one. She was not asking herself whether she would survive or where she would sleep, or how long $17 could be made to last. Those were practical questions, and she was a practical girl. The question that walked beside her like a shadow was older and stranger than any of that. It was simply this: why had Minerva left her this particular piece of land? Minerva Marsh had been Harriet's grandmother on her mother's side, a woman who had outlived Harriet's mother by 11 years, and who had spent the last 3 decades of her life living alone on a remote property that no one in the county had ever thought was worth anything. Minerva had died the previous spring, quietly and without fuss, which was consistent with everything else she had ever done. Wendell had received notice from the county clerk. He had gone alone to deal with the paperwork and returned home with 2 items, the deed and the envelope, which he had placed in a kitchen drawer and left there for 6 months without explanation. Harriet had found the envelope herself 3 weeks ago while looking for a needle and thread. She had not opened it then. She had looked at her name written on the front in her father's handwriting and placed it back in the drawer and gone to bed. But she had not stopped thinking about it. And when Wendell placed it on the table this morning alongside the deed, she had understood that the 6 months of silence had been his version of deliberation. She opened the envelope for the first time on the road, walking, not slowing her pace. The $17 she counted and replaced. But there was something else inside, something she had not expected. A second smaller fold of paper written in a hand she did not know at first, and then recognized with a start, that moved through her like cold water. It was Minerva's handwriting, cramped and deliberate, the letters pressed hard into the page as though the pen had been working against some resistance. She read only the first line before she folded it back. It was enough for now. She would read the rest when she had stopped moving and her hands were still. The walk into Rimrock took the better part of 2 hours on the main road. It was a small town in the way that most Wyoming towns were small in those years, meaning it had one of everything that mattered. One general store, one saloon, one church, one smithy, and approximately one opinion on any given subject shared among most of the population at any given time. Obadiah Cole's general store occupied a corner building on the main street, its windows full of the organized abundance that Harriet associated with the smell of her early childhood, when her mother had still been alive and they had come to town together on Saturdays. Cured meats and coffee beans and bolts of sturdy cloth, and the particular sweetness of molasses kept in large ceramic crocks near the back. She pushed open the door, and the small brass bell above the frame announced her arrival. Obadiah Cole was behind the counter, a heavy-set man in his middle 50s with spectacles that he wore perpetually pushed up into his hairline and only brought down to his nose when he was examining something he wanted to assess carefully. He brought them down now to look at the deed she placed in front of him. He took his time. Obadiah Cole always took his time when he was thinking, which Harriet had observed over the years was not because he thought slowly, but because he had learned that silence made other people nervous. And nervous people made decisions that tended to benefit Obadiah Cole. "The Hollow Rock claim," he said finally. He set the deed on the counter and pushed his spectacles back up. "My condolences on your grandmother's passing, Harriet. Minerva was a fixture out here for longer than most people remember." He paused. "But I have to be straight with you. This piece of land is less than nothing. It's a tax liability. All cliff face and ravine, no soil worth speaking of, and the water situation as well." He spread his hands. "The only living things that have ever done well out there are rattlesnakes, and even they'd probably prefer somewhere else." "Has anyone lived on it?" Harriet asked. Something moved across Obadiah Cole's face, quick and carefully controlled. "Your grandmother, for a period of time." He picked up the deed again, turning it over as though the back might offer additional information. "Minerva was a particular kind of woman. Stubborn in her ways. I had occasion to speak with her about this property some years back, offered her a fair price to take it off her hands, and she declined." He set the deed down again. "I'll make you the same offer now. It won't be much, but combined with what you have there, it ought to cover a stage ticket east with something to spare." Harriet looked at him steadily. Obadiah Cole had the practiced geniality of a man who had spent 40 years selling things to people who needed them, and beneath it she could see the gears turning. He wanted this land. He had wanted it 15 years ago, apparently, and he wanted it now. She did not know why, but she filed the fact away. She reached into the envelope and removed the second folded paper, Minerva's note. She opened it and read the first line again, and this time she read the second. "Harriet," it began, "don't sell, not ever. Don't sell to Obadiah Cole, and don't sell to anyone who comes after him. There is something I left there for you." She folded it back and put it in her pocket. Obadiah was watching her face. She kept it still. "I'll need a good axe," she said, "a bow saw, 50 pounds of flour, a block of salt, and however many dried beans the rest of the money will buy." Obadiah Cole stared at her for a long moment. The expression on his face made a slow journey from calculation through surprise and arrived somewhere in the vicinity of reluctant respect, though it was the kind of respect a man pays to someone he believes is making a profound and irreversible mistake. "That'll leave you with next to nothing," he said. "I'm aware of that." He calculated on a scrap of brown paper, his pencil moving with practiced efficiency. He could have given her a fair price. She knew from years of accompanying her mother to the store what things cost. He did not give her a fair price. He charged her roughly 15% more than the goods were worth, the kind of margin that was just small enough to be difficult to argue about and just large enough to be meaningful over the total. She counted the money out exactly and placed it on the counter. She looked up at him when she was done, not with anger, because anger would have been a luxury, but with a directness that made him look away first. "I'll remember these prices, Mr. Cole," she said. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact delivered with the flatness of a woman who intended to still be alive when the time came to act on it. She was reorganizing the pack outside, trying to find the balance point that would distribute the weight of the flour sack most efficiently across her back when she became aware of being watched. She looked up and saw Everett Holt standing near the entrance to his smithy 30 feet down the street. He was a compact, serious-faced man in his late 30s, with forearms darkened by the work and a tendency to observe things with the particular stillness of someone who spent his days dealing with materials that demanded patience. He was watching her struggle with the pack straps. She saw him register the problem, saw something shift in his posture, a small but distinct forward lean that meant he was about to step toward her. And then he stopped. He stood there for a moment with that forward lean arrested halfway, his hands at his sides, and on his face was an expression that she could not fully interpret, not indifference, something more complicated and more painful than indifference. He looked like a man who was stopping himself from doing something he believed he shouldn't do, which was different from a man who simply didn't care. Harriet adjusted the straps herself, found the balance she needed, and straightened up. She looked at Everett Holt directly. He looked back. Neither of them spoke. Then she turned and walked toward the far end of town, toward the road that led east and up into the hard country. Everett Holt turned and went back into his smithy. What she did not see, because she was already facing forward, was that he went straight to his workbench, picked up a length of iron stock, and set it in the fire without a commission, without an order, without any clear reason he could have articulated to anyone who asked. The shape that emerged from under his hammer over the next 2 hours was a set of door hinges, solid and well-made, designed to last through weather that would destroy lesser work. He set them in the corner of the shop when he was done and stood looking at them for a moment. Then he went back to work on the things he'd been paid to make. She had not gone 50 feet past the edge of town when she heard Dillard Decker's voice behind her. "Hey there, girl." She stopped, but did not turn immediately. Dillard Decker was a trapper and sometime hunter who occupied a particular social position in Rimrock, that of the man who had been everywhere and done everything and had opinions about all of it. He was somewhere in his early 40s with a snow-weather-beaten face and the particular swagger of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything, at least not in any story he told about himself. She turned. He was standing on the general store steps with another man she didn't know, a young ranch hand with a tobacco tin in his shirt pocket, and both of them were wearing the kind of expressions that men wear when they believe they are about to say something clever. "Heard you bought yourself a ticket to the Hollow Rock claim," Dillard said. "That right?" "That's right." He worked at the inside of his cheek for a moment. "You know, I spent 3 weeks out there once, 10, 11 years ago, prospecting." He said it with the emphasis of a man who wanted her to understand that he was not some casual visitor. 3 weeks, cold as a stone floor at night, not a drop of water worth drinking, rattlers in every crack. He paused for effect. "The only thing that kept me going was knowing I could leave whenever I decided to." "And you decided to after 3 weeks," Harriet said. Something flicked across his face. Not anger, something closer to embarrassment that had learned to dress itself up as amusement. "Smart girl," he said, and his tone had shifted. "Here's the thing. I know that land. I know what it is and what it isn't. And what it isn't is survivable. You go out there with a pack of flour and a bow saw, and you'll be back in town inside of a month, and that's if you're lucky about the weather." He leaned back against the post. "If you're not lucky about the weather, well, we won't find you till spring." Harriet looked at him for a moment, not with anger, with something that was closer to assessment, the way you look at a piece of terrain you are about to cross. "What would you have done differently?" she asked. "Those 3 weeks, in retrospect." Dillard opened his mouth and then closed it again. The question had landed somewhere unexpected. He hadn't been asked for advice. He'd been braced for defiance or tears or the particular stubborn silence of young women who'd made up their minds. The question was genuine, and it threw him. "I'd have gone in with more food," he said finally, "and I'd have gone deeper into the cave before I gave up on the water situation." "How deep did you go?" Another pause. 30, 40 feet maybe. She nodded, picked up her pack. Thank you, Mr. Decker. She turned and walked away. Behind her, she heard Dillard mutter something to the ranch hand, and she heard the ranch hand laugh, and she kept walking. What she carried with her from that exchange was not what Dillard had intended to give her, which was discouragement. What she carried was a piece of information. Dillard Decker had not gone deep enough. Dillard Decker had given up at 30 or 40 feet. She would not give up at 30 or 40 feet. The journey to Hollow Rock took 2 full days. The first day was hard but manageable. The road still visible, the terrain merely demanding. The second day, the road became a track, and then the track became a suggestion, and then there was nothing but the land itself, fractured granite and thorny scrub, and the occasional ragged stand of wind-bent pine. The flour sack across her back ground at her shoulders with every step. She stopped more often than she wanted to. She ate sparingly, drinking from a creek she crossed on the afternoon of the first day, and not finding water again until she reached her destination. She found Hollow Rock at dusk on the second day in that particular light that makes everything seem both more beautiful and more final than it actually is. The cliff face rose from the earth with the permanence of something geological and indifferent, unbothered by the century or the season. At its base, exactly where the deed described, was a dark opening in the stone wide enough for a person to enter with a pack on their back, its edges worn smooth by water that had long since moved elsewhere. She stood in front of it and felt for the first moment since she had walked off her father's porch the full weight of what she had done. The cold was real and getting colder as the light failed. Behind her there was no shelter, no stand of trees, no structure of any kind. There was only the land she had come from, 12 miles of it, growing darker by the minute. She lit her lantern and went inside. The entrance passage was short and opened into a larger chamber, and then the larger chamber opened into something she had not expected. The air changed as she moved deeper. The howl of the September wind, which had been her constant companion for 2 days, diminished and then disappeared entirely, replaced by a stillness that was not the stillness of emptiness, but of mass. Tons of rock above and around her, absorbing and holding and steadying the air within. The temperature was cool but stable, not the biting cold of outside. Something that felt like a temperature arrived at by negotiation between the deep earth and the surface world, one that had settled on a number and intended to hold it regardless of what the weather chose to do above. She went deeper. Her lantern light moved across walls that were smooth in places, rough in others, and it was in the rougher section near the back wall of the largest chamber that she saw the first of them. Small marks in the stone, not random, not the work of weather or time. The marks of a tool pressed deliberately into the granite by a human hand in patterns that resolved themselves as she brought the lantern closer into something recognizable. An arrow, a number, another arrow pointing left. Minerva had been here, not just visited but inhabited. The marks were the notations of someone who had learned a place thoroughly enough to map it. She sat down on the cave floor, took out the folded note, and read it fully for the first time. Harriet had said, "I don't have much to leave you, and I'm sorry for that. But I have this 30 years of knowing that the land at Hollow Rock is not what people say it is. It is not useless. It is not a hole in the ground. It is only not meant for impatient people. There is water deeper than Dillard Decker went. There is warmth from the earth itself. There is soil if you know to bring it in. I have left markers. And there is one more thing which you will find when you need it, not before." She folded the note carefully and placed it back in her pocket. Dillard Decker had been here. He had gone 30 or 40 feet and given up. Minerva had gone further and had stayed 30 years and had left the knowledge of how in carved stone and a letter that had waited in a kitchen drawer for 6 months until the right moment. Harriet set her lantern on a flat rock and listened to the silence. Somewhere in the deeper dark, she could hear it, a slow, rhythmic sound, barely a sound at all, more like the memory of a sound. She picked up the lantern and followed it, moving carefully over the uneven floor, following one of Minerva's arrows, and found it in a fissure in the far wall. A single drop of water gathering at the lip of the stone, trembling for a moment in the lantern light, and then falling with a clear, resonant sound into a shallow basin in the rock below. The pool it had made over years or decades or longer was small but clean, and when she touched her finger to it and brought it to her lips, it tasted of nothing but cold stone and time. She placed her hand flat against the wall beside it. The rock was cool, and beneath the coolness, there was something else, a faint, deep warmth, the stored memory of 1,000 summers conducted through the geology of the earth. It would not warm a room. It would not replace a fire. But in the coldest part of winter, when everything above ground was locked in ice, this stone would hold its temperature steady and certain the way things hold that have spent long enough underground to have stopped caring about the weather. Minerva had known all of this. Minerva had lived inside this knowledge for 30 years and had done the only thing she could think of to pass it on. She had written it down. She had carved it into the stone, and she had arranged through the instrument of Wendell Marsh's arithmetic for her granddaughter to end up standing here with $17 and nowhere else to go. Harriet stood in the cave with the lantern and the water in the deep, patient warmth of the earth and felt the despair that had been building since she left the porch that morning arrive at its highest point and then, without any drama, begin to recede, not disappear. She was not a girl who believed in dramatic transformations, but it changed character. The despair shifted from the dead weight of having nothing to something more, like the tension of a problem that has not yet been solved but has begun to reveal its edges. Minerva had seen this. Minerva had understood something that Diller Decker and Obadiah Cole and every other practical person who had looked at this piece of ground had failed to see. A cave was not a hole. It was a buffer. It was a constant. In a world where everything above ground was subject to the tyranny of weather, a cave was the one place where the ground itself would argue back on your behalf. She set her pack down. She would eat something. She would sleep. In the morning, she would begin. The last thing she did before she slept was stand at the cave entrance and press one palm flat against the outer wall of stone, feeling the cold of the surface give way after a moment to the deeper steadiness beneath. She thought about Minerva doing this in the same place in all the seasons and all the years that had passed before this one, standing here taking the measure of something that did not change. "You were right about everything, weren't you?" she said quietly, not to the darkness, but to the absence where Minerva should have been. The water dripped. The rock held its warmth. Outside, the September wind moved across the cliff face and found no entry, which was the point of the cliff face and always had been. She closed her eyes. For the first time since the latch had clicked behind her that morning, Harriet Marsh slept without difficulty, and in the morning she would understand that this itself was information that the body knows before the mind admits it when a person has arrived somewhere that fits them. She was exactly where Minerva had planned for her to be. She did not know yet everything that meant, but she was beginning to. The first tree she felled nearly killed her. She had watched her father cut timber a dozen times over the years, standing at a distance that he considered safe and she had considered boring. She remembered the sequence: size up the trunk, read the lean cut the notch on the fall side first, then the back cut higher and slightly angled. The tree would go where the notch told it to go in theory, assuming the notch was cut correctly, assuming the lane was read correctly, assuming a dozen other variables that her father had never bothered to name, because to him they were not variables but simply the way things were. She cut her first notch on the wrong side. The pine, a straight, grained specimen about 14 inches across that she had selected specifically because it appeared uncomplicated, made a sound like a slow exhalation and began to fall in precisely the direction she had not prepared for. She moved. Not fast enough for comfort, fast enough for survival. The trunk hit the ground 6 feet from where she had been standing and bounced once with a violence that suggested it had more opinion about the matter than she had credited. She stood still for a long moment, breathing. Then she looked at the stump, at the notch she had cut, at the direction the tree had fallen, and she understood her error with the complete clarity that near misses provide. She adjusted her mental model, walked to the next tree, and spent 10 minutes simply looking at it before she raised the axe. The second tree fell where she intended. By the end of the first week, she had 12 logs stripped of their branches and lying near the cave entrance. Her hands had blistered, bled, and begun to develop the first rough layer of what would eventually become callus. She ate thin flour porridge twice a day and felt her body consuming its own reserves to make up the difference between what she was burning and what she was taking in. She was aware of this the way you are aware of a clock running down steadily and without drama, and she calculated the remaining time with the same precision she applied to everything else. The foundation stones came next. She quarried them from the ravine floor, flat-sided pieces of shale and granite that she could lever rather than lift, moving them on improvised rollers made from the branches she had trimmed. The work was slower than the timber cutting and in some ways more punishing because it required sustained low-grade effort rather than sharp, explosive effort, the kind of work that finds every weakness in a body and applies pressure to it without relief. She laid the foundation in a rectangle, 12 of her paces by 8 positioned, so that the back wall would be the cliff face itself. Minerva's markers had shown her the best position, a place where the cave entrance sat naturally within what would become the rear of the structure, where the prevailing wind came from the northwest, and the cliff would deflect the worst of it, where the morning sun would reach the front wall first and stay longest. The cabin walls went up log by log, each one a problem of leverage and positioning that she solved with rope, with a simple A-frame she built from 3 poles lashed together, and with the kind of repetitive patience that either breaks a person or becomes part of them. By the end of the second week, the 4 walls stood rough and gapped, but standing. She ran her hand along the exterior and felt the solidity of it, not the solidity of something finished, but of something that had achieved the first threshold of structural integrity. Chinking came next, a cold and miserable process of mixing the sandy ravine soil with water and dead grasses into a thick slurry and forcing it into every gap between the logs. Her hands went numb in the wet mixture and stayed numb. The mud dried slowly in the October air, and she went over the walls twice, finding the gaps she had missed, filling them, checking again. When it was done, the wind no longer moved through the walls, it moved around them. That distinction, invisible to the eye but immediately apparent to the body, was the difference between a structure and a shelter. She was building the fireplace when Wilhelmina Whitfield came. Harriet heard the horse before she saw the rider, and she straightened up from her work among the stones to find a woman on a black horse stopped at the edge of her claim, watching her with an expression that communicated neither welcome nor hostility, but a careful calculating neutrality that Harriet recognized as the default position of someone who had learned not to invest quickly. Wilhelmina Whitfield was somewhere in her mid-30s with a face that had been shaped by outdoor work and solitude into something spare and precise. She was a widow. Harriet would learn later, her husband lost to a mining accident 5 years back, living alone on a small farm 4 miles to the west. She had the self-contained quality of a person who has reorganized their life around the fact of their own company and found it, if not entirely satisfactory, at least reliable. People in Rimrock called her Billy, though she had never encouraged the nickname. It had simply happened the way nicknames do to people who are too private to object in time. She looked at the partially built fireplace for a while. Then she said, "That will kill you." Harriet waited. "The chimney," Billy said. "You're building it too short. In this wind, at this elevation, a short chimney will push the smoke back into the room. You'll go to sleep one night and not wake up." She paused. "I've seen it happen." "How tall does it need to be?" Harriet asked. Billy studied the structure. "At least 2 handspans above the peak of the roof. More if you can manage it." She looked at Harriet directly. "Your roof line is going to be there." She pointed. "So your chimney needs to reach there." She pointed higher. This was specific, actionable information delivered without softening and without the implication that Harriet ought to be grateful for it. It was the information of one practical person to another. Harriet noted it and nodded. "You're Minerva Marsh's girl," Billy said. It was not a question. "Her granddaughter." Billy looked at the cave entrance behind the cabin frame. Something moved in her expression, but she kept it contained. "I knew Minerva," she said, "well enough to know she didn't do anything by accident." She looked back at Harriet. "That's all I'll say about that." She turned her horse. "Fix the chimney." She rode away without a further ceremony, and Harriet stood watching her go and then turned back to the fireplace and began revising her calculations for the chimney height. The first fire she lit in the completed hearth produced a room full of smoke and sent her outside coughing into the cold. She stood in the October air and let the smoke clear and then went back in and examined the flue, carefully finding the obstruction, a partially collapsed section she had not packed firmly enough, and cleared it. The second attempt drew properly. The smoke went up and the heat came out, and she sat on the dirt floor in front of it and felt the warmth reach through her coat and her shirts and into the muscle beneath, and she did not move for a long time. She was building garden beds in the cave when she found the tin box. She had been following Minerva's markers, hauling bucket after bucket of the dark, rich soil she had found in a sheltered hollow of the ravine, creating raised beds in the section of the cave where the faintest thread of light reached from the entrance. The work was repetitive enough to allow a portion of her mind to move independently, and that portion had been working through Minerva's letter again, specifically the final line. There is one more thing which you will find when you need it not before. The arrow on the cave wall pointed to the back corner where the floor met the wall at a seam of softer stone. She dug there 2 feet down and her hands found oilcloth. The tin box inside was the size of a bread loaf sealed with clay around the lid. She opened it at the cave entrance where the light was best. Inside, a packet of seeds, small and dark, wrapped in dry paper with a label in Minerva's hand identifying them as a cold hardy carrot variety, and a small square of paper covered on both sides in Minerva's compressed writing. The front side contained planting notes, depth spacing, water requirements, the specific quality of light the variety needed, and how to supplement it in a cave environment using reflected lantern light. Minerva had worked this out over years, possibly decades, and had written it down with the precision of someone who understood that knowledge is only useful if it survives the person who holds it. Harriet turned the paper over. On the back, in smaller letters, as though added as an afterthought that was not an afterthought at all, "Don't buy seeds from Cole's store. He keeps last year's stock and sells it as new. These will grow. His won't." Harriet sat with the paper for a long time. Minerva had not simply lived on this land. She had studied it, mapped it, tested it, and documented her findings with the systematic thoroughness of someone who intended the documentation to be used. The tin box was not a cache of supplies. It was a lesson plan. Every item in it was chosen because someone coming to this land in fall with limited resources would need it, and Minerva had been certain enough to bury the box and wait that the right person would eventually come looking. She planted the seeds that afternoon following Minerva's instructions precisely and watered them from the stone basin. She had been alone at Hollow Rock for 31 days when she found the footprints. She noticed them on a morning after a light snowfall, the first real snow of the season, not the killing kind, but enough to record what had moved across the ground in the night. The prints came from the direction of the main road, right to the cabin to within 20 feet, circled. It once at that distance, paused at a point where the cave entrance was visible through the cabin's open front, and then returned the way they had come. She followed the trail to the tree line and found what she was looking for caught on a rough piece of bark, a small, flattened cylinder of hand-rolled tobacco, extinguished carefully against the stone, the kind of careful extinguishing that was habit in dry country. She had seen Dillard Decker roll in smoke exactly this type in the general store. He had come in the night. He had looked. He had not knocked. She understood this the way she understood most things about Dillard Decker, as information rather than offense. He had come because he needed to know if she was still alive, and he had not knocked because knowing and admitting he needed to know were two different things that he was not yet ready to connect in public. She filed the information and went back to work. 3 days later, she woke at 3 in the morning to a sound she could not immediately place. It was rhythmic and close, a low, deliberate scraping against the cabin wall, and her body responded before her mind did, putting her on her feet with the fire poker in her hand before she was fully conscious of having moved. She stood in the dark and listened. The scraping came again lower now, and then she heard a different sound beneath it, a heavy, wet snuffling that identified the visitor beyond any doubt. A black bear, driven from its ranging ground by the early cold, had found her cabin by the smell of her stored food and the animals in the cave. She had no gun. She had considered this problem in the abstract during her planning in September and concluded that a gun was a luxury she could not afford and that she would manage without one. She was managing without one now in the dark, with a bear attempting a methodical investigation of her exterior wall, and the management required was different in character from what she had imagined in September. She did what the situation offered her. She moved the animals deeper into the cave past the garden beds to the furthest point from the entrance. She returned to the cabin and put out the fire completely, not banking it, but killing it so that the smell of smoke and food and warm habitation that had drawn the bear in would diminish. Then she stood in the complete dark, in the complete cold, and she waited. The bear worked at the wall for another 20 minutes. Then she heard it move away from the structure. Pause, move further, pause again, then nothing. She stood in the dark for another hour before she was certain. In the morning, she rebuilt the fire and went to check the wall. The logs had been scored in 3 places, the marks of claws reading like a record of the bear's interest in its gradual diminishment. She repaired the chinking where it had been loosened and reinforced the section with additional timber braced against the interior. Then she looked at the tin box again at the back of Minerva's seed paper and found something she had read before without fully absorbing. At the bottom of the backside, below the note about Cole's seeds in letters so small, she had to hold the paper close to the lantern. If you hear scratching at night, kill the fire. They follow warmth and smell. They don't like the dark any better than you do. She laughed. It was a short sound, slightly unhinged, entirely genuine. Minerva had known about the bears too. Minerva had known about everything. The snow that Billy Whitfield's warning had implicitly promised arrived on a Tuesday in November. Not the killing blizzard, but its preliminary, a steady fall of 4 inches that transformed the landscape overnight and reminded Harriet, if she needed reminding, that the serious part of the season was approaching. She was preparing for it as thoroughly as her resources allowed when she heard the horse again and looked out to see Billy dismounting with a feed sack over one shoulder. This time Billy came all the way to the door. She set the sack down on the threshold without ceremony. Inside it were turnip seeds, a length of cured hide, and a piece of paper that said in Billy's compressed handwriting, "Don't thank me. I just don't want to dig a hole in the spring." Billy was back on her horse and moving away before Harriet had finished reading the note. Harriet looked at the sack and then at the retreating figure and understood something about Wilhelmina Whitfield that the woman herself might not have fully articulated. She was lonely in the specific way of someone who has decided that loneliness is the price of safety and has been paying it so long, she has almost stopped noticing what it costs, almost. She stored the seeds and went back to work. The return trip to Rimrock came in late November when her flour was down to what she estimated was 3 weeks' supply, and the window before deep winter closed was narrowing to something she could measure in days. The walk back was different from the walk out. Her body was harder in a way she hadn't noticed happening, the softness of a farm girl's life replaced by something more functional and less comfortable. Her hands wrapped in rags against the cold were almost unrecognizable to her when she looked at them. She pushed open the door of Cole's General Store, and the bell announced her, and Obadiah looked up from his ledger, and the expression on his face was worth the 12 miles. It moved through surprise calculation and something that might have been shame in approximately 3 seconds, and then settled into the careful neutrality of a man conducting a transaction he had not expected to be conducting. She needed 4 laying hens and a breeding pair of sheep, a ewe and a ram, plus additional salt and what remained of her cash. Obadiah priced the animals higher than they were worth. She had expected this and had counted the money before she left, and she paid what he asked without argument, because argument took time she did not have, and because what she said to him instead quietly as he counted the bills served the same purpose. "I'll be back in spring, Mr. Cole," she said, "with eggs to sell if the hens take to their new home. I'd want a fair price then." It was a statement of intention dressed as a request, and they both understood it as such. Obadiah counted the bills a second time without responding. She was tying the crated hens to her pack frame when Fletcher appeared in the doorway of the store. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she was seeing him differently now from the perspective of someone who had spent 2 months learning what a body could actually do when it had to. He looked at her with an expression that contained relief and something more complicated, the look of a boy who has been keeping a promise in secret and is relieved to find the promise was not in vain. "I told Father I was coming to get salt," he said. "Did he need salt?" "He will," Fletcher said. This appeared to be sufficient justification in his view. He looked at the hens, the sheep already penned in Cole's yard, waiting for her, the pack that was already loaded past the point of comfort. "Let me carry something." "Fletcher, I know you're going to say no. Then save us both the time." He looked at his boots for a moment. When he looked up, his expression had simplified into something more direct. "Are you all right?" "Yes." "Are you actually all right, or are you saying that because you know I can't do anything about it if you're not?" This stopped her. She looked at her brother, 14 years old, standing in the doorway of Cole's store in the November cold with his hands shoved in his pockets, and understood that he had grown more than his height while she had been away. "Both," she said finally. "Mostly the first." He nodded. "Father asks about you," he said. "He doesn't ask me directly. He asks if I've heard anything. I think he means to ask if I've heard you're dead." "Tell him I'm not," she said. "And tell him that in spring, if he wants to trade seed stock for eggs, I'll be open to it." Fletcher absorbed this. He seemed to understand that it was more than a commercial proposition. "I'll tell him," he said. She turned back to the pack. Behind her, she heard Fletcher take one step toward her and then stop himself. She did not turn around, but she heard the step in the stopping, and it told her everything she needed to know about the kind of person her brother was becoming, the kind that learns to respect other people's directions, even when every instinct says otherwise. Dillard Decker was not in Cole's store that day. She did not see him in town at all. She did not remark on his absence, but she noted it. The journey back with the animals took most of a day and depleted reserves she had been trying to protect. The hens objected throughout. The sheep were initially difficult, and then, as if they had reached a collective decision, simply walked where she walked and gave her no further trouble. When she finally guided them through the cabin door and into the cave, the youth stopped at the entrance, scented the air for a long moment, and then walked in without further hesitation. The rooster made a sound that might have been complaint or approval. Harriet chose to interpret it as the latter. December came in stages and then all at once. She fell into the discipline of it, the daily sequence that survival at Hollow Rock required, and found that the discipline was not as she had feared it might be, a grinding monotony. It was more like a piece of music with a fixed structure, but room for variation, and each day's variation told her something new about how her system was working, or failing to work, or working in ways she hadn't anticipated. The hens laid, not abundantly but consistently, 1 or 2 eggs each morning, which provided a protein source she had not been certain she could count on. The sheep settled into the cave as though they had been born to it, and their body warmth raised the cave temperature by a degree or two that was genuinely meaningful on the coldest nights. The garden grew. This was the thing that continued to surprise her, even after she had stopped being surprised by it, the way that growth persists when its conditions are met, regardless of what is happening outside those conditions. The carrots were small and pale. The lettuce was not what any gardener would display with pride. But they were alive, and they were nourishing, and they were growing in a cave in December in Wyoming, which was not something she had read about in any book, and not something anyone in Rimrock would have believed if she had described it. She tended them with the specific attention you give to things that are doing the improbable, careful not to disturb the balance that was making the improbable possible. The day she read the last section of Minerva's letter, she had been at Hollow Rock for 37 days. She had been rationing the letter the way she rationed everything else, reading one section at a time, letting each part settle before moving to the next. The final portion she had saved without quite knowing why, the way you save the last of something valuable, not because you have decided to save it, but because your hand keeps reaching for other things first. She read it sitting beside the garden beds with the lantern propped against a stone. Minerva had written, "I have told you about the water and the warmth and the soil. Those are the things I can describe in words. There is one more thing that I cannot describe exactly, only point toward. The land at Hollow Rock will test you in a way you do not expect. Not with cold, not with hunger. Those tests you are ready for. The test I mean is other people. They will come. Not when you want them and not in the form you imagine. When they come, remember that help is about ability, not deserving. And remember that the hardest thing is not surviving alone. The hardest thing is knowing when not to. Harriet read this 3 times. Then she sat with it in the dark for a while, listening to the water drip and the sheep breathe. She understood the first part. She had been thinking about help and deserving since the morning her father had set the envelope on the table, the particular arithmetic of who was owed what by whom. Minerva was telling her to set that arithmetic aside, or at least to not let it make decisions for her. The second part she thought she understood, but she was not certain. She filed it where she filed things she was not certain of in the part of her mind that continued working on a problem after the conscious attention had moved elsewhere. 2 weeks later, the wind changed. She knew it not because she heard a difference, but because she felt one. A pressure shift in the air that the cave registered before her ears did a subtle change in how the stone resonated with the movement outside. She had been at Hollow Rock long enough to know what ordinary weather felt like from the inside. This felt like something that had decided to be more than ordinary. She went through her preparations with systematic care. Wood stacked against the interior wall enough for 5 days if she used it with discipline. Water drawn from the basin and stored in every vessel she had. The animals in the cave with fresh bedding and 2 days' worth of grass. The chimney flue set to draw, but not so wide as to let the wind reverse it. The door brace cut and ready. She had been sitting by the fire finishing the last of her preparations when she read the final lines of Minerva's letter, the lines she had arrived at by saving them for when she most needed them. When they come, the letter said again in her memory, not if. She wedged the door brace into place and settled in to wait for what was coming. The blizzard did not build, it arrived. 1 hour, the sky was the color of old pewter, low and pressured and still. The next hour, the world outside the cabin window was gone, replaced by something that was not weather in any familiar sense, but felt more like a verdict delivered without appeal against everything that had been built, or planned, or hoped for in the open air. The snow did not fall so much as it flew horizontal and hard, driven by a wind that had no interest in being a wind and every intention of being a force. Harriet stood at the small window she had salvaged from a derelict wagon and watched the landscape disappear. The glass vibrated faintly in its frame. She had packed the edges with twisted rags and pine pitch 2 weeks ago, and the seal held, and she was glad of the work she had done then because she could not have done it now. Outside, the temperature was dropping fast enough to feel intentional. She turned from the window and looked at what she had. The fire in the stone hearth was burning with the steady indifference of something well-fed and well-designed. The stack of split pine beside it was large enough to last 4 days if she was careful on, if the storm gave her reason to be more careful than that. Through the low doorway that connected the cabin to the cave, she could hear the sheep moving in their pen, a soft rhythmic sound unhurried which told her that whatever the storm was doing to the outside world had not penetrated far enough to reach them. She moved through the doorway into the cave. The transition was immediate from the warm, active air of the cabin into the steady, ancient cool of the rock. The sheep looked at her without alarm. One of the hens made a small sound from the roost she had built into the far corner and then tucked her head back under her wing. The garden, pale and disciplined in its raised bed, stood as it always stood, patient and indifferent to drama. She went back into the cabin and wedged the heavy pine brace against the door. Checked the windowsill one more time, adjusted the flue to account for the way the wind was coming. Then she sat down near the fire with a length of rawhide she had been braiding into rope and began to work. She was braiding when the sound came. It was not the wind. She had been listening to the wind for hours, had cataloged its pitches and rhythms the way you catalog the sounds of something you live with, and this was not part of that catalog. It was a different rhythm, entirely muffled and irregular, coming from the direction of the door. She set down the rawhide and sat very still. It came again. 3 impacts against the heavy plank, each one weaker than the last. And then faint enough that she might have imagined it, a sound that was not the storm, a human sound, not a shout, something worse than a shout. The particular diminished cry of a person who has nearly stopped believing that crying will help. She stood up and took the iron poker from beside the hearth. Not because she was certain she would need it, but because certainty was a luxury the situation had not offered her. She moved to the door and pressed her ear against it, feeling the cold radiate through the wood, and listened. Another impact. Weaker still, she lifted the brace, set it aside, and pulled the door open against the resistance of the wind. The man on her doorstep fell inward. He was more snow than man, at first a shape that collapsed across her threshold and onto the cabin floor with the loose, uncoordinated weight of someone who had been spending the last of a reserve they hadn't known was finite. She pulled him clear of the doorway and put her shoulder into the door, forcing it shut against the wind, and dropped the brace back into place before she turned to look at him properly. She recognized the face before she recognized the man. The broad, weather-beaten features, the heavy jaw. Dillard Decker, blue around the lips, his skin the particular grayish-white that told her she had perhaps 20 minutes to make a meaningful difference before the cold he had absorbed became something his body could not recover from on its own. She moved without hesitation. She pulled his wet outer layers off, an operation that required more strength than she expected because his hands had gone clumsy and he was only intermittently conscious enough to assist. She wrapped him in the only spare blanket she had and pulled him as close to the fire as she judged was safe. He was shaking by the time color began to return to his face, which was a good sign, though it didn't look like one. "Dillard," she said, "Dillard Decker, stay awake." He opened his eyes. They were unfocused for a moment, then sharpened. He looked at her at the fire at the interior of the cabin, and on his face she saw something she had not seen there before in any of their prior encounters. Not gratitude, not yet. Something more fundamental. The raw, unguarded expression of a person who had been very close to an ending and had unexpectedly arrived somewhere that was not one. "Harriet Marsh," he said. His voice was a rough scrape of itself. "You're going to be all right," she said, "but I need you to talk to me. Keep your mind working." "Wagon," he said. "The Coles, Obadiah and Martha, their wagon." He coughed deep and rattling. "Overturned on the East Road, a mile and a half, maybe 2. I was trying to get here. Saw your smoke before the storm closed in. I thought it was." He paused, and something almost like a smile moved across his face. "I thought it was a ghost." Harriet was already at the pegs by the door, taking down her coat. "How long ago?" she said. "An hour, maybe more, I don't." He tried to push himself upright and managed to get as far as his elbow before his arms decided they had other priorities. "I'll come with you." She looked at him on her floor, wrapped in her blanket, still shaking. "You'll keep the fire going," she said. It was not unkind. It was simply the accurate assessment of what he was capable of and what the situation required. "That is how you help. Keep the fire. Don't let it drop." Dillard Decker, who had laughed at her in Obadiah Cole's store 3 months ago, who had told her she wouldn't survive the first month, lay on her cabin floor and nodded. There was nothing in his face that argued with her. Whatever argument might have been there once had been stripped out by the cold and the hours he had spent getting here. She put on everything she owned. 2 wool shirts, the coat, the scarf wrapped twice around her face until only her eyes were exposed. She took the lantern and the coil of rope she had braided herself and the remainder of the soup in a sealed pot because the coals would need warmth from the inside as well as the outside when she found them. She opened the door and the storm came in like it had been waiting personally for her. The wind hit her with both hands. She bent into it and kept moving, keeping the cliff face to her left because it was the only fixed reference point in a world that had otherwise dissolved into moving white. The snow was at her knees in places thigh-deep in the low spots where it had drifted. Each step required a separate decision, a lifting and a pushing and a placing, and the effort of 300 steps in that manner was the effort of a mile on ordinary ground. She could not see the lantern light extending more than 4 feet in front of her. She navigated by the cliff by the compass she kept in her coat pocket and by the memory of the road's angle relative to the rock face, which she had walked often enough in better weather that she trusted her body to know the direction, even when her eyes had nothing useful to offer. She found the wagon by nearly walking into it. It was on its side in a depression, off the road, half buried already, one wheel still turning slowly in the wind, with a sound she had taken for a branch and now understood differently. She went around it holding the lantern up and found them on the lee side, sheltered from the worst of the wind by the wagon's bulk, pressed together in the way that people press together when they have run out of other options. Obadiah Cole looked up at the lantern light with eyes that took too long to focus. Martha Cole, pressed against her husband's side, looked up faster, and her expression when she recognized Harriet through the scarf was the most complex thing Harriet had ever seen on a human face. Relief and shame, and something that might have been wonder, all arriving at the same moment through the same eyes. Harriet did not waste time explaining herself or accepting their surprise. She got them to their feet with gestures and shouted words that the wind ate before they arrived anywhere useful. Obadiah could walk, but barely. Martha was steadier, and in fact, it was Martha who took her husband's other arm without being asked and helped Harriet carry the weight of him back across that 1.5 miles of drifted nightmare. On the way, pressed close enough to be heard over the wind, Martha said something Harriet did not expect. "He wanted to come out here," Martha said, "before the storm. He didn't tell me why." Harriet kept walking. "When 2 weeks ago, he saddled up and rode out east and came back before dark without saying where he'd gone. I found frost-cracked clay on his boots that matched the color of the ravine out this way." A pause while they negotiated a drift. "I've been married to Obadiah Cole for 30 years. I know when he's done something that's eating at him." Harriet absorbed this information and kept moving. Obadiah Cole had ridden out to Hollow Rock 2 weeks ago and had not knocked on her door. She filed it away to understand later, because later was a concept she intended to arrive at. She had lost feeling in her toes by the time the cabin appeared as a vague, warm shape in the white. The fire behind the window glass was a small, precise point of orange light, and she moved toward it with the last of what she had. Dillard Decker had kept the fire exactly as she had left it. He had also found the pot hook and moved the soup closer to the heat, and had managed to refill the wood stack from the pile she kept near the inner wall. He was on his feet when they came through the door, one hand on the wall for balance, but upright, and the look on his face when he saw the three of them arrive was something she would not easily forget. It was the look of a man who had placed a bet against something and been very glad to lose. She got them to the fire. She got the soup distributed. She got Martha Cole's wet outer things hung near the heat, and Obadiah settled on the bench with a blanket around his shoulders and a bowl of something warm between his shaking hands, and then she stood near the doorway and let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of the hour. She was still standing there when Obadiah looked up from his bowl and said, "I want to see the rest of it." She led him through the low doorway into the cave. He stood in the entrance and held his lantern up, and she watched him see it: the sheep in their pen, the hens on their roost, the orderly raised beds of the garden with their pale winter growth, the stone basin where the water dripped its eternal patient drip. He walked along the wall and raised the lantern to the marks Minerva had carved there, the arrows and numbers and notations of someone who had learned a place completely. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. "Minerva," he said finally. It was not a question, it was a recognition. "She lived here for 30 years, Harriet said. She knew every inch of it." Obadiah touched one of the carved marks with the tip of one finger lightly, the way you touch something you are beginning to understand you have fundamentally misread. "I came out here 2 weeks ago," he said. "I know." He looked at her. "You knew. I found the traces your horse left in the hardened ground after you left. And I knew you didn't knock." He was quiet again. "Then I needed to see. I told myself it was curiosity, practical interest." He lowered his hand. "That wasn't what it was." "What was it?" Obadiah Cole looked at the garden, at the thin, pale rows of growth that should not have been possible in December, in a cave in Wyoming, and she could see him assembling something, building towards something he was not accustomed to building. He was a man who had spent his life in the architecture of commerce, where everything had a value, and the value was the point. This was a different structure entirely, and his hands weren't quite the right shape for it. Minerva Marsh came to my store, he said slowly, a long time ago, a long time, and I told her this land was worthless, in exactly those words. I told her she should sell it, take the money, and go somewhere that made sense. He paused. She looked at me the way she always looked at me, like I was a problem she'd already solved and didn't find very interesting anymore. And she said, Obadiah, you know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And she walked out. The water dripped. The sheep breathed. I've thought about that sentence a great many times in the years since, Obadiah said. I thought I understood it. I thought she meant I was too focused on money. But standing here, I think she meant something more specific. I think she meant this. He gestured at the space around them, the stone and the garden and the water. She could see what this was. I looked at the same ground and saw what it wasn't, and I called that judgment. Harriet watched him. There was nothing she wanted to say that she trusted herself to say without error, so she said nothing. Obadiah reached into his coat with hands that had mostly stopped shaking and removed a folded paper. He held it out to her. This represents the difference between what I charged you for the axe and the comb and the rations and the livestock and what those things actually cost. I've had it in my pocket for 6 weeks. I told myself I was waiting for the right time. He looked at her steadily. I was waiting until I was sure you wouldn't come back to town and spend it before winter finished you. That was the truth of it. Harriet took the paper. She unfolded it and looked at the amount, which was exactly right, calculated to the cent. I'll remember this price too, Mr. Cole, she said. But her voice had changed from the last time she had said those words in his store with that particular flat warning in it. This time it was something closer to the beginning of an understanding. He nodded, then he said, I'd like to buy your eggs when you have them to spare. Fair price, and I mean it this time. And the vegetables, Martha said from the doorway. Harriet turned and found that Martha had followed them in, standing with a blanket still around her shoulders, taking in the cave with the eyes of a woman who had run a household for 30 years and knew exactly what she was looking at. If you can get carrots to grow in here, Harriet, there are families in Rimrock who will pay honestly for fresh carrots in February. Dillard Decker's voice came from behind Martha. He had followed as well, moving carefully, still not entirely steady on his feet. He stood in the cave entrance and looked around him with an expression that was not wonder exactly, because Dillard Decker was constitutionally resistant to wonder, but was as close to it as his face was likely to get. I was 35 feet in, he said, maybe 40. He said it to no one in particular. I thought I'd done the whole thing. You stopped at the first chamber, Harriet said. I did. He looked at Minerva's marks on the wall, the arrows that had led her past where he had quit. She left a map. She left more than that. Dillard was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular difficulty of a man who has not had much practice at this specific activity, he said, I said some things in Cole's store about your chances. He looked at her directly, which cost him something. I said them because I needed you to fail. Not because I wanted bad things for you personally, but because if you succeeded, it meant I'd missed something 10 years ago that was right in front of me. He paused. That's not a reason. It's just the truth. I know, Harriet said. I'll tell people what I saw here when we get back. Tell them whatever you actually saw, she said. That's all I want from it. Dillard nodded. He turned and went back to the fire, moving slowly, and she heard him begin with the careful, deliberate motions of a man rationing his energy to split the wood she had left on the inner stack. He had not been asked. He simply did it. She understood this was Dillard Decker's version of the same currency Obadiah had just offered her in paper form. Different denomination, same intent. The storm held for 3 days. In those 3 days, Harriet did not stop moving. She maintained her schedule as though she had no guests rising before light to tend the fire and the animals and the garden, because the garden did not care about the blizzard, and neither did the schedule, and because maintaining it was how she demonstrated, without making any speeches, what the past 3 months had actually been. She did not perform it. She simply continued to do it, and they watched. Martha Cole turned out to have opinions about the garden, specific and practical ones. And by the second afternoon, she and Harriet were having a genuine conversation about soil acidity and seed spacing that had nothing to do with the social gulf that had existed between them in town. Martha had grown up on a farm, something Harriet had not known, and her hands remembered what her life in the general store had temporarily made her forget. Obadiah spent the second day sitting near the stone basin watching the water. He did not speak much. He thought visibly the way some men think when they have run up against something that requires them to revise a large portion of what they have assumed. It was not comfortable to watch, but Harriet respected him because she had done her own version of it alone in September, and she knew what it cost. Dillard steadied her by the second morning when tasked without being pointed at them. He restacked the firewood more efficiently than it had been stacked. He examined the pen fencing Harriet had built from woven saplings and reinforced two sections where the weave had begun to loosen. He did not ask permission or offer commentary. He simply saw things that needed doing and did them. And this too was a language she understood. On the evening of the second day, with the storm still pressing against the cabin walls and the fire burning low and steady, the four of them sat in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. Dillard was the one who spoke. "Minerva Marsh came through Rimrock once when I was maybe 20 years old," he said. "She stopped at the store, which is where everyone stopped, and I was there buying ammunition, and she looked at me with those eyes of hers, like she was reading something written on a surface that wasn't quite my face." He was quiet for a moment. "She said, 'Dillard, the land doesn't lie, people lie.' And then she bought her things and left." Harriet looked at him across the fire. "Do you know what she meant?" "I've been thinking about it since I found out you were out here," he said. "I think I do now." He looked at his hands. "I lied to myself for 10 years about why I gave up out here. I told myself the land was no good. But the land wasn't the problem. I was the problem. I quit because I couldn't see what there was to see, and instead of admitting that I couldn't see it, I decided there was nothing to see." He paused. "Minerva knew. She could tell that was the kind of man I was. She said it 15 years before I'd believe it." The fire spoke for a while in his silence. "I'm not sure I fully believe it even now," Dillard said, "but I'm closer than I was." Harriet thought of the note in her pocket, worn soft at the folds now from handling. She thought of Minerva writing those words, pressing the pen hard against the page, knowing that the person reading them might not be ready to understand for a long time. Minerva had been patient in that way. Patient with the stone, patient with the seasons, patient with people. The morning the storm broke, the world emerged from under it quietly. The wind dropped before dawn, and when Harriet opened the cabin door at first light, the air was still and cold and clean, and the snow lay over everything in a silence that felt earned. Obadiah Cole shook her hand before they left. His grip was firm and held for a moment longer than a handshake requires. "A fair price on the eggs," he said. "And whatever else you grow that you can spare, you'll find me honest this time." He paused. "I had to know whether you'd still be here in December. Now I know." Another pause. Minerva would have been, I think, pleased. That isn't quite the right word, but she would have recognized what you've done here. Martha embraced her, which Harriet had not expected and did not resist. "Come to town when you can," Martha said. "Not for us, for yourself. You don't have to be as alone as Minerva was." Harriet considered that. Martha was suggesting that Minerva had chosen a degree of solitude beyond what had been strictly necessary, that there was a distance between what Minerva had done and what Harriet needed to do. She would think about that when she had time. Dillard was the last to leave. He stood outside the cabin door with his horse's reins in his hand and looked at the cliff face and the cave entrance and the cabin built against the stone and said nothing for a while. "Next time I come out this way," he said finally, "I'll knock first." "You'll be welcome," Harriet said. And she meant it, which surprised her slightly less than she expected. She watched the three of them move away through the new snow, growing smaller, until the white of the landscape absorbed them, and then stood alone in the particular quiet that follows the departure of people who have been very present. The cliff face behind her caught the early light at an angle that made the granite look almost warm. She had work to do. She went inside to begin it. Spring came in stages, the way things come when they are working against something stubborn. It arrived first as a softening, a slight but unmistakable easing in the quality of the cold, and then as the sound of water moving in places it had not been moving before the snow melt finding its channels. Then came the light longer each day, reaching further into the cave entrance in the morning, and staying a little longer each evening, touching the garden beds in the way that light touches things it has been kept from for a while. The ewe delivered a lamb on a Tuesday morning in late March. Harriet had been watching for the signs and was present for it, which was fortunate because the lamb came into the world in the wrong position and required intervention. An operation she had read about in a livestock manual she had borrowed from the county library 2 years ago and never expected to need. She needed it. It worked. The lamb stood on uncertain legs, and the ewe cleaned it with systematic thoroughness, and Harriet sat back on her heels in the straw and allowed herself to feel briefly and completely the fullness of what was in front of her. New life. In the place where everyone had said life was not possible. She planted the garden outside in the first week of April in the patch of ground along the eastern base of the cliff where she had spent the winter enriching the soil with cave material and ash from the hearth. The seed potatoes had arrived with Fletcher, who had appeared one morning with a pack on his back, and Wendell's expression on his face and the slightly sheepish look of someone who has been caught keeping a promise. "You said the end of summer," Fletcher said. "It's April." "I know." He set down his pack. "I couldn't wait." He looked around him at the cabin and the cliff and the cave entrance, taking it in with the systematic attention of someone who had been imagining it for months and was now comparing the imagined version to the real one. "It's smaller than I thought and bigger." She understood what he meant. It was small in its dimensions and enormous in what it had required. "The potatoes," she said. He handed over the sack. "Father included those," he said carefully. "He didn't say anything, just put them in the pack." Harriet held the sack. The potatoes inside were of a particular variety, small and waxy, the kind that Minerva had grown in the kitchen garden when Harriet's mother was still alive. She knew because her mother had told her once incidentally, "The way you mention things, you assume everyone knows." Wendell had kept them. For years he had kept that seed stock, and now he had put them in his son's pack without a word and sent them east toward the daughter he had set out with $17 in a folded deed. She looked at the potatoes for a long moment. This was Wendell's language, the same language he had always spoken, objects and actions in place of words, the arithmetic of what was given rather than what was said. She had spent 18 years wishing he would speak differently. She thought now that she might be old enough or tired enough or wise enough from her own season of silence to understand that this was simply the grammar he had and that the sentence he had just composed in it was as direct as he knew how to be. She would plant the potatoes. They would grow. That was what he had meant. That was all of it. "You can stay a week," she said to Fletcher. "There's more to learn in a week than you can carry. Come back in August if you want more." He grinned, which was the Fletcher she remembered from behind the rippled glass of the window, the boy watching her leave. "August," he said. "I'll be here." Wilhelmina Whitfield came in the second week of April in daylight for the first time on her black horse, with a small apple tree wrapped in burlap tied behind the saddle. She dismounted without being invited and carried the tree to the eastern wall of the cliff and stood there for a moment orienting herself. "Here," she said, indicating a spot where the rock face jutted slightly, creating a natural windbreak on the north side. "Planted here, the stone will hold the heat. Give it enough water the first summer, and it'll root deep enough to handle the winters after that." Harriet dug the hole. Billy unwrapped the tree and set it in with practiced efficiency, and together they filled the hole and tamped the earth around the roots. When it was done, Billy stood back and looked at the small tree standing against the large stone with its bare spring branches, just beginning to show the first swollen hints of leaves. "Minerva used to sit in this spot," Billy said. Harriet stopped. "I knew her," Billy said. "Not well. Minerva didn't do well in terms of people knowing her. She was very complete in herself. Difficult to find a way in." She was quiet for a moment. "But I brought her things sometimes. When the winters were bad, left them at the entrance and went back. She never said thank you, and I never expected her to. We had an arrangement." "Like ours," Harriet said. Billy looked at her with a sideways expression that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. Like ours, she agreed, though you are somewhat easier to find a way into than Minerva was. She would have considered that a flaw. A pause. I don't. They stood for a moment in the April light, the cliff warm at their backs, the small tree between them. She would have been pleased, Billy said. Not exactly the same words Obadiah had used, but close enough that Harriet understood Minerva had left impressions in the people around her, the way she had left marks in stone. Direct, deliberate, lasting. I keep finding things she prepared, Harriet said. Things she left for exactly the situation I was in, like she planned it. She did plan it, Bailey said flatly. Minerva planned everything 30 years in advance. It was irritating when she was alive, and I imagine it's remarkable in retrospect. She turned to go. The tree will need water twice a week until July. After that, it knows what to do. Harriet watched Billy ride away the black horse moving through the spring light with an unhurried authority that suited them both. She turned back to the small tree against the cliff and looked at it for a while. That afternoon, she went deep into the cave. She brought her lantern and went past the garden, past the animal pens, past the stone basin, with its endless, patient drip to the back wall of the deepest chamber, where one of Minerva's arrows had pointed since October, and she had understood for a month now what it meant. She dug where the arrow indicated in the corner, where the floor met the wall at the depth. Minerva's notation had specified. 2 feet down, her hands found something that was not rock. She cleared the earth away carefully and lifted out a flat piece of wood wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with a clay thin enough to slide under a door, but wide enough to need both hands to hold. She brought it to the lantern. It was a map, not of the cave, only not of the claim only, but of the entire surrounding terrain, drawn in charcoal on pine board, with a precision that could only have come from years of walking every piece of ground it described. 30 years of observation rendered into a single document. Soil quality marked by a system of symbols. Water locations indicated, including 3 she had not yet found. Elevations noted. Exposures marked for how many hours of daily sunlight each position received in each season. And in the corner in Minerva's compressed, deliberate handwriting, 3 lines. This is not a piece of useless land. This is a piece of land that has been waiting for someone with the patience to see it. I waited 30 years to find the right person. I found her. Harriet sat in the cave with the board across her knees for a long time. The lantern burned steadily. The water dripped. Above her, tons of stone held the world in place with the equanimity of something that has watched everything pass and has stopped being surprised by any of it. She thought about Minerva alone here through 30 winters, carving arrows into granite and saving seeds in tin boxes and writing letters that would not be read for years. She thought about what it required to act in faith that far forward to prepare for a person you would never live to see arrive. She thought about all the people who had looked at this piece of ground and seen only what was absent from it and had called that an accurate picture of what the place was. And she thought about Minerva looking at the same ground and seeing something else entirely, something that required patience to find and patience to develop and patience to trust and being right and having no one to tell. She understood now what Minerva's last line in the letter had meant. She had thought it referred to the tin box. It had referred to this. She carried the board out of the cave and into the spring light and stood in front of her cabin with it. The cabin with Everett Holt's hinges on the door. Wait, she set the board down. The hinges were not yet on the door. That was still to come. She was still standing there, the board in both hands, and the thought of those hinges still somewhere in the future when she heard the sound of a horse on the road. Not Billy's unhurried black horse. A different rhythm. She set the board on the outside table she had built from the rough wood of her early logs and looked toward the track. Everett Holt came around the bend at a steady walk, his horse picking its way through the spring mud with the careful attention of an animal that has learned not to hurry in uncertain ground. He was carrying something across the saddle in front of him wrapped in cloth. He dismounted without ceremony and unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a set of iron hinges, solid and precisely made the work of someone who had taken more time than the task strictly required. "Your door hinges are going to fail before next winter," he said. He was looking at the cabin door rather than at her. The wood they're set in has started to check. You'll need these before the cold comes back. Harriet looked at the hinges. Then she looked at Everett Holt, who was still studying the cabin door with the focused attention of a man examining a professional problem, and she understood with complete clarity that he was not here because of the hinges. "You made those in September," she said, "the day I left town." He looked at her then. "Yes. You've been carrying them since September." "I've been waiting for the right time to bring them," he said. "I kept thinking it wasn't the right time. Winter was wrong, too much like checking whether you'd survived." He paused. Spring seemed better. Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long does it take to fit them?" "An hour, maybe less." "Come in when you're ready," she said. "There's water on the fire." He nodded and began unpacking his tools from the saddlebag, and she turned and went inside, and if either of them felt the weight of all the months that had passed since that moment outside Cole's store, neither of them said so, because some things are better understood than spoken, and this was one of them. Everett Holt worked in silence. He was good at his trade in the way that men are good at things they have done long enough to stop thinking about his hands moving with the quiet confidence of competence. Harriet made coffee and set a cup near him, and he drank it without comment and kept working. When the hinges were fitted, he swung the door twice to test the movement, nodded at what it told him, and began packing his tools. "The map on your table," he said. "Minerva's," Harriet said. "She drew it over 30 years. He looked at it from a distance, not touching it. "There are places marked on there I've ridden past for years without knowing what they were." "So had she," Harriet said. "At first." Everett looked at her. It was a different kind of looking from September, less guarded, as though something had shifted in the angle between them over the course of the winter, even though they had not seen each other in all that time. "What will you do with it?" he said. "Use it," she said. "Build what it shows. It'll take years." "Most things worth building do," he said. He took his horse and rode back toward the road, and she stood watching until he was out of sight, and then she turned back to the map on the table and stood over it for a long time, reading it, the way you read something you intend to spend your life understanding. Harriet Marsh was 18 years old. She had survived a winter that the town of Rimrock had bet she wouldn't survive. She had built a shelter that had kept not only herself but 3 other people alive during the worst blizzard in recent memory. She had grown food in the dark and tended animals in the cold and learned the language of a piece of land that everyone else had given up on, and she had done it by following the knowledge left by a woman she had never really known and now would never stop knowing. She looked out from her piece of ground at the Wyoming morning, the sky, that particular clear blue that comes after storms, the kind of blue that makes the world look freshly made. The cliff behind her held the warmth of the new sun against her back. The apple tree held its first leaf buds up to the light. The work would never be done. She had understood this since October, and the understanding had only grown more precise since then. There was always more to learn and more to build and more to tend and more to understand. Minerva's map described a lifetime of projects. She would not complete them all. She would complete what she could and leave what she couldn't for whoever came after. She folded the map with the same care Minerva had used to preserve it and carried it inside to the table where the letter and Billy's note in the seed paper already lay. 4 documents, 4 different kinds of trust. She placed the map among them and stood back. Then she went outside to begin the morning's work, because the morning did not wait, and neither did she, and the land at Hollow Rock had things yet to show her, and she had her whole life in which to learn them.